My name is Kleg, and I'd like to share with you some thoughts about what we often consider the first Thanksgiving. And it goes back to the story of the pilgrims who established the Plymouth colony. But I'd like to take you back, first of all, to their beginning. And we look at the Midlands of England in the early 1600s. And in 1603, King James took the throne and replaced Queen Elizabeth. At the time, the Church of England was the only church in England that people were allowed to attend. And it was governed by a group called the House of Bishops. And there were those that were very dissatisfied with the church and who had hoped that when King James took the throne, that he would be more lenient and allow people to worship on their own and not have the restrictions and the penalties if you did not worship with the Church of England. However, just the opposite was true. He became less tolerant of people who were separating from the church and placed more strict restrictions, including jail. And like Queen Elizabeth, any pastor that separated from the Church of England, led their own church, would be guilty of treason, punishable by death. But in the Midlands of England, in an area not too far from Sherwood Forest, which we know from the story of Robin Hood, was a small hamlet by the name of Scooby. And there you had mostly farmers. And there were a group that decided to separate from the Church of England. And by the way, there were two groups at the time that the House of Bishops did not like. And one group was known as the Puritans. And the Puritans decided to stay within the church and try to see changes take place as they worked in the church. The other group were known as separatists, later to be known as pilgrims. But the separatists determined that they could not stay in a church where they had to give allegiance to King James as the head of the church, that they could only give allegiance to Jesus Christ. And they also wanted to be able to freely study the Word of God and to have it taught the way that they felt it should be taught. So the separatists formed their own church, secretly meeting, and in this small group of separatists, again, the manor of Scooby was a man named William Brewster, and who was very successful at the time, very well educated, and very, very well off financially. And then there was a young 16-year-old by the name of William Bradford. And William Bradford loved the Lord. He had been orphaned at a young age, was being raised by his uncles, and when he told his uncles that he had decided to leave the Church of England, they gave him their wrath. And his response was, "I am not only willing to suffer for this cause, but I am thankful that God has given me a heart so to do." Wow, what a tremendous faith for a 16-year-old. And he loved the Lord, and he loved joining together with other people that loved the Lord. But it wasn't long before they realized that with the authorities, eventually they would be found, they would be jailed, and perhaps the leaders, James Robison was their pastor at the time, and William Brewster would most likely be executed for the crime of treason. So they decided to go to Holland, where there was religious freedom, and other separatists had gone and established a church. And they made arrangements in 1607 with an English sea captain to secretly meet along the coast. They sold all their belongings and met with him, got on board the ship. And no sooner were they on board the ship than authorities arrived and arrested them. The English sea captain had betrayed them. They were placed in homes in the English town of Boston because there were too many to be placed in jails, and there was men, women, and children. And they were held there for several weeks before they were all released and returned to the Scooby area, where they had already sold their properties but moved in with other relatives. And then the following year, 1608, in the spring, decided to try it again, and this time hired a Dutch sea captain, met along a secret place along the coast. And this time, they had the men board the ship first, and the women and children and supplies were on a barge. And they were waiting for the tide to come in so that the barge could come out to the ship. But before that happened, a large group, including the authorities, came marching down the coast. And the captain, right away, yelled out Sacramente, and that means head for the open seas. And the separatist men are standing watching as the women and children are being manhandled and arrested. And they're on a ship with only the belongings on their back, the clothing on their back, headed for open sea. Now, if you can imagine things getting worse, it did. It got much worse. They ran into what was called a nor'easter, which would be a ferocious storm during this time of the year. In fact, it was so bad that it took them close to the 300 miles off the coast of Norway. What should have taken them a day to get to their destination, which was Amsterdam, Holland, took almost 2 weeks. And in the worst part of the storm, when it seemed like there was no hope, the pilgrim men yelled out, "Yea, Lord, thou canst save. Yea, Lord, thou canst save." And immediately the sea calmed and the storm abated. And when they arrived in Amsterdam, the people could not believe that they had survived such a ferocious storm. Well, by the end of 1608, somehow all the women and children had managed to come and join their husbands in Holland. And they decided to settle in a town called Leiden, which was a manufacturing town, mostly of cloth, clothing, and where they had jobs. And they spent the next 12 years there. There was a growing concern that they saw the Dutch society being a bad influence on their children, ungodly influence. They began to pray that God might direct them to a place where they could share the gospel with other people. And the more they prayed, the more they felt that they were to go to the New World, to the East Coast of America. And they were aware of the fact that there had been a colony in Jamestown that had been founded, an English colony, but obviously had not succeeded. And yet they felt that they were to establish an English colony, which meant they needed to get a charter from England in order to do that. And they set out to do that very thing. And they really felt the Lord calling them to make arrangements to go to the New World and to establish a colony of their own and build it on principles laid down by God in the Bible. And this ends part 1, and Lord willing, I will continue with part 2 in a few minutes.